Many people say that the Chinese People's Volunteers were able to draw the US Army in the Korean War because of their fearless spirit. Under the guidance of this statement, there have also been many rumors that the volunteers won by relying on crowd tactics. It is indeed important that soldiers are not afraid of death, but it is not the decisive factor in the outcome of a war. If you can win the war without fear of death, the Boxers can win the 8-power Allied forces. After such a bomb explodes on your position, is it important that you are not afraid of death? A pile of immobile debris, even if you don't fear death, your enemies won't pay the slightest attention. In the face of modern firepower, the sea of people has no meaning, and it is purely a gift. However, the firepower of the volunteer army is far inferior to that of the US Army, and there is no Navy and Air Force. Under the deduction of modern military theory, the volunteer army will undoubtedly lose, but the actual combat result is a tie. This kind of victory shows that the volunteer army must be far stronger than the US military in a certain field, forcibly smoothing out the gap in firepower. Through careful research, military scientists finally discovered the secret of the strength of the volunteer army, which is the ability to gather energy and disperse it. In the theory of modern warfare, armies must be gathered together, and scattered armies have no combat effectiveness. Once the army loses its organizational system, even if there are tens of thousands of people alive, they will directly default to zero combat effectiveness, and the existence of this army will no longer be considered in the combat command. Since the troops can only form combat effectiveness when they gather together, the mobilization of the troops is extremely clumsy. The two sides often fight repeatedly for several months for a traffic artery. Under the support of this theory, the defense line of the army after deployment is composed of multiple scattered positions, and the gaps between the positions are huge, so that very few soldiers can be used to control a huge amount of land. But these gaps are impossible for the enemy army to pass through, and they dare not bypass them at all. If the enemy wants to knock down these scattered positions one by one, then we will have enough time to give reinforcements. This is how ordinary armies play. During the War of Liberation, the People's Liberation Army invented a method of deep interspersed and roundabouts, which can ignore the opponent's position, maneuver, and intersperse at will, and completely control the battlefield, allowing its own troops to easily form a situation where more troops fight less on local battlefields. At the beginning, it was a small scale interspersed in depth at the company level and platoon level. In the end, it is the large scale and deep penetration of the entire regiment, the entire division, and even the entire corps. The first time the People's Liberation Army used large scale and deep penetration was the Battle of Mengliang, which wiped out the 74th Division of the Kuomintang Ace Army and killed the famous General Zhang Lingfu. The combat effectiveness of the reorganized 74th Division is extremely strong. If there is a one-to-one battle, the outcome is still unknown, but our army does not intend to fight a fair decisive battle with the 74th Division. In the Battle of Mengliang, the Kuomintang invested a total of 450,000 troops, and the People's Liberation Army invested a total of 270,000 troops. The ratio of the enemy's strength to our own was 2:1. It seems that the Kuomintang has the upper hand in military strength, but after large-scale maneuvers, within 100 miles of Mengliang, there are only 135,000 Kuomintang troops in total, while the People's Liberation Army has gathered more than 200,000 people, and the ratio of enemy forces to ours has become 1:2. Within 10 miles of Mengliang, the People's Liberation Army gathered 5 columns with a total of more than 100,000 people, and attacked Zhang Lingfu's 26,000 people violently, with a ratio of 1:5 between the enemy and us. Judging from the entire battlefield, the People's Liberation Army is outnumbered, but in Mengliang's case, Zhang Lingfu is outnumbered. The elite 74th Division completely collapsed in 3 days under the mad attack of more than 100,000 people. In this battle, Zhang Lingfu's entire army was destroyed, the Kuomintang reinforcements suffered more than 6,000 casualties, and a total of 32,000 casualties, while the People's Liberation Army suffered 12,000 casualties, and the 74th Division of the Kuomintang's Ace Unit was wiped out in an organized manner. It was a brilliant victory. In the face of the large-scale and deep penetration tactics of the People's Liberation Army, the Kuomintang army was walked around like puppets on a string. No matter how many troops were invested, they would never be able to surround the People's Liberation Army, and would always be surrounded by the People's Liberation Army. The tactic of ignoring the enemy's position is too powerful, but so far, only the People's Liberation Army on Earth can use this tactic. Ordinary troops can infiltrate small groups of troops through the gaps in enemy positions, and can also complete independent combat tasks behind enemy lines. Such troops are generally called special forces. Special forces of hundreds or even thousands of people can be trained, but troops of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people can complete this tactical interspersed. It's not that it can't be done, it's that it can't train so many special forces. To achieve large-scale and deep penetration, the first thing to do is to have absolute control over the battlefield. If you are discovered by the enemy as soon as you have thousands of people interspersed, what awaits you is the massacre of the enemy's firepower. During the Liberation War, we found that the Kuomintang army seemed to be blind, unable to detect even the People's Liberation Army a few kilometers away, and often laughed at the Kuomintang army for being too incompetent. But when it came to the Korean battlefield, the performance of the US military was not as good as that of the Kuomintang army, and even the volunteers a few hundred meters away could not be found. The enemy can't control your whereabouts at all, which is the first prerequisite for realizing large-scale and deep penetration tactics. In the previous battles of the Korean War, the US military showed amazing slowness. Under the premise of aerial reconnaissance, they couldn't even figure out where the volunteers were and how many people they dispatched, and they were beaten dizzy. This kind of battlefield control is achieved by a group of soldiers comparable to special forces. Everyone should have heard of Chiu She-yun's deeds. Chiu She-yun and hundreds of comrades were lurking only a few hundred meters away from the US military positions. During the fire reconnaissance of the US military, the wild grass around Chiu She-yun was ignited by incendiary bombs. Burnt until a heroic sacrifice. Chiu She-yun's sacrificial oil painting. Fragments of Chiu She-yun's military uniform. The case of Chiu She-yun not only illustrates the extremely high discipline and spirit of sacrifice of the volunteer soldiers, but also illustrates the fact that hundreds of troops lurked under the noses of the US military all night, but the US military did not notice this at all. True. This shows that the US military has completely lost control of the battlefield. In the Battle of Changjin Lake, the discipline and spirit of sacrifice of the volunteers were more obvious. At that time, the nighttime temperature was as low as -40 degrees Celsius, but a large number of volunteers still carried out latent activities under the cover of night, which caused the loss of personnel due to frostbite to far exceed that of combat. The 5th Company of the 242nd Regiment of the 81st Division of the Volunteer Army was ordered to set up an ambush on the way to the retreat of the US Army, but when the battle broke out, no one stood up and charged. The cotters and soldiers of the 5th Company that had already launched a battle formation were all frozen to death on the ground. There were many volunteer soldiers who were frozen to death in the night, far more than a 5th Company. After their bodies were sent to the rear, they still maintained a lying down fighting posture. And there are countless volunteers who were frostbitten and disabled. Such a well-disciplined unit possesses the athletic ability of invisibility, and can launch surprise strikes at any time. Why only special forces can rush lightly? Because if you bypass the opponent's position, it means that your logistics cannot be delivered, and your troops will fall into a state of no logistics. A howitzer shell weighs 86 caddies. How many shells can you bring without logistics? Only light infantry who rely on minimal logistics are eligible to ignore the opponent's position, and only need to carry a small amount of food and grenades to maintain combat effectiveness. But if you do this, it means that your light infantry will enter the enemy's rear, completely lose fire support, and at the same time may be divided and surrounded at any time, and will fight passively if the will is a little weak. Therefore, only strictly trained special forces can do this. Once ordinary troops disperse, their combat effectiveness will decline precipitously. Any commander knows the benefits of being able to gather and disperse troops, but no one dares to do so. But the volunteer army is an exception. The volunteer army is not born with much heavy firepower. It has long been used to fighting in an environment without firepower, and has long been used to fighting behind enemy lines without logistics. All members have strong willpower, which has created an army composed entirely of special forces. Therefore, large-scale and deep interspersed tactics can only be used by the Chinese military in the world, and other countries cannot learn it if they want to. The US military has never seen such an opponent. It was miserable to be beaten in the face of such extremely flexible and changeable tactics. It wasn't until the 5th battle that Ridgway of the United States finally discovered the weakness of the large-scale and deep penetration tactics, and almost dealt a fatal blow to the volunteers. As I said just now, ordinary troops feel particularly rigid and clumsy because they have to get together and maintain logistics, and they have to knock out the opponent's positions when marching. The large-scale and deep penetration tactics of the volunteer army can ignore the opponent's position, easily penetrate through the gaps in the position, and wantonly penetrate and maneuver like a liquid, so it is very flexible and can easily encircle and annihilate the opponent. But this tactic has weaknesses. Any army employing this tactic is doomed to be logistically useless, as the enemy positions in the rear are not knocked out. The reason why light infantry can adopt this tactic is because of its minimal logistical requirements. But no matter how small it is, there is demand. After research, Lee Kuei found that the volunteer army's large-depth interspersed tactics, the supplies carried by the light infantry can only last for 7 days at most. Later, Lee Kuei came up with a particularly insidious tactic. First, he indulged the penetration of the volunteers, deliberately showing weakness, and luring the enemy to go deep. After a month of fierce fighting, the US military retreated continuously. Since many US military positions had not been knocked out, the PLA's logistical supply was extremely difficult, and the transportation time of the supply line reached 7 days. At this time, the US military concentrated its superior forces, opened the way with elite armored troops, and directly tore apart the volunteers' positions, aiming directly at GOR-1. GOR-1 is a core logistics base of the volunteer army in the rear. It has hoarded a large amount of supplies of the PLA and is located in a plain area with convenient transportation. If GOR-1 is captured, the volunteers on the front line will lose all their supplies and will be in a situation where they will run out of ammunition and food. Fighting forward, no ammunition; retreating, no food. The only fate is the destruction of the whole army. Once that many troops were routed, the US military would have won the Korean War. In order to prepare for this decisive blow, the US military dispatched a contingent of more than 47,000 people, 1,327 artillery pieces, 187 tanks, and prepared 2,000 sorties of aircraft. This task force has been hiding in the rear and has not participated in any combat. When the supplies of the volunteers on the front line are exhausted, the whole army will attack. There is only one purpose of the operation, and that is to capture GOR-1, destroy the volunteer army's logistics center, and then completely divide all the volunteer troops surrounding the front line. If successful, this is another version of the Incheon landing, and the volunteer army will be in a big rout. After discovering the movement of this contingent, the volunteer army immediately withdrew. But retreat takes time, and 2 legs cannot run on 4 wheels. It would take the volunteers a total of 15 days to reorganize the line of defense, but the task force only needed more than a day to reach GOR-1, which is still a plain area, which is especially suitable for the US military to display its firepower. The troops that could reach GOR-1 in time were only the 63rd Army, with a total of 25,000 people in 3 divisions, more than 240 artillery pieces, and no tanks or planes. Boss Pen gave the 63rd Army a death order and must stick to GOR-1 for 15 days. Fu Kongbai, the commander of the 63rd Army, estimated the strength of the enemy and us, and believed that only by building strong field fortifications could this goal be achieved. It takes at least 3 days to build a strong field fortification, but the US contingent has already arrived at the door. So Fu Kongbai gave a death order to Cai Chang Yuan, the commander of the 189th Division under his command, that he must delay the US military for 3 days and give the 63rd Army time to repair fortifications. The time for 189 divisions to repair fortifications is only a few hours. Cai Chang Yuan repeatedly calculated the comparison of the strength of the enemy and us, and found that no matter how he fought, it was impossible to stop the US military. If there is no cover from fortifications, numbers are meaningless in front of artillery. Even if the entire army is sacrificed, it may not be able to stop the US military for a day. If the US military breaks through its position, the 63rd Army, which is building fortifications in the rear, will be in chaos. If the 63rd Army is also broken through its positions, the hundreds of thousands of volunteers on the entire front line are in danger of being wiped out. Even if the entire army of the 189th Division died, it would not be able to stop the US military. But now as the division commander, Cai Chang Yuan must find a way to stop the US military for more than 3 days. What to do? Cai Chang Yuan made a decision that has never been seen before or since, and brought into full play the characteristics of the volunteer army's ability to gather and disperse energy, making the GR-1 sniper battle the pinnacle battle in the history of human light infantry warfare. The 189th Division was disbanded on the spot, disbanded into more than 200 small units, dispersed to a huge area of 20 kilometers wide and 25 kilometers deep, totaling 500 square kilometers, and established more than 200 simple positions. There are only more than 30 soldiers in each position, fighting on their own. This tactic left Lee Kuei dumbfounded and completely overturned his common sense as a military strategist. Before the battle, Lee Kuei deduced many possibilities, but he did not deduce this one. The US contingent of 47,000 people gathered together, 1,327 artillery pieces and 187 tanks opened the way facing a simple position with only more than 30 light infantry. After setting up the formation, it only takes a few tens of minutes for the US military to tear up this position easily, and the defensive volunteers cannot survive. Isn't this a death sentence? But there are more than 200 positions like this. If they knock down one by one like this, 3 days will have passed by the time the positions are knocked down. The task of the 189th Division is completed. This tactic seems very simple and effective. But looking at the world, only the volunteer army can adopt this tactic of disbanding in situ, and it is impossible for the armies of other countries to learn it. Let me tell you about the difficulties here. First of all, after you adopt this tactic, it is equivalent to directly telling all the soldiers under your command that we must lose this battle, and the purpose is only to complete the strategic task. And no matter whether this task is completed or not, the soldiers on the front line will undoubtedly die, without even a little hope of survival. How many soldiers are willing to perform such a combat mission? There are more than 200 positions, and each position is several hundred meters apart. The first position to contact the US military was torn to pieces within tens of minutes, and none of the soldiers on it survived. The dozens of positions in the back can be seen clearly, but they can't support them. They can only watch the front-line comrades die. And they also know that the next person who will die is themselves, and they will definitely die. The ordinary army attaches great importance to the first battle of the vanguard. If the first battle is won, the morale will be like a rainbow, and if the first battle is lost, the morale of the army will be turbulent. The situation that the 189th Division is now facing is that every few tens of minutes there will be news of the destruction of the vanguard army. The entire army in the first position was wiped out, and all the comrades in arms above died. The entire army in the second position was wiped out, and all the comrades in arms above died. The third position was completely annihilated, and all the comrades on it died. In such a situation, the morale of ordinary troops has already collapsed, ranging from passive combat to direct surrender. As for the 189th Division, hundreds of positions were destroyed in a row and more than half of the soldiers were sacrificed, but they still maintained a strong fighting spirit and successfully persisted for 3 days, leaving enough time for the construction of fortifications in the rear. In the end, the 63rd Army successfully held on for 15 days, allowing the main force on the front line to complete its retreat and restabilize its position. Lee Kuei had no choice but to return home. If he didn't leave, the task force would be dumped. In such an advantageous combat environment, the US military still has not completed its own combat missions, which made the US completely lose its confidence in victory, and is finally willing to sit down for serious peace talks. In the previous battles, the volunteer army demonstrated what it means to be able to disperse and gather. The troops are elusive and easy to gather together, forming an encirclement of the US military on local battlefields, and annihilating the enemy with superior forces. In the fifth battle, the volunteer army demonstrated what it means to be able to gather and disperse. The troops that had been gathered took the initiative to disperse and sacrifice one by one. Through the earth-shattering spirit of sacrifice, the strategic mission was completed. You say that the volunteer army is not afraid of death, then it is true that they are not afraid of death. But this kind of not being afraid of death is not that kind of unnecessary sacrifice, let alone charging in a sea of people, but the value that every soldier must die. Lee Kuei once sent a battalion to imitate this tactic of the volunteers, but found that the US Army lost its logistical supplies and heavy artillery fire support, and could only throw grenades close to its body. It's nothing, it's just a gift. Many countries have tried to imitate the volunteer army's tactics of gathering and dispersing, but without exception, they have all failed. The combat effectiveness of the dispersed troops has declined sharply, and only a small number of special forces have succeeded. and this fact means that every light infantry unit of the PLA is at the level of special forces abroad. This is why the Chinese army is called the world's first army and the pinnacle of human light infantry. There is no one before, and I guess there will be no one after. An extremely special background, an extremely special culture, and an extremely special system have led to the Chinese military having such characteristics and combat effectiveness. The Air Force, Navy, and heavy firepower of the Volunteer Army are indeed far inferior to those of the US Army, but relying on the advantages of light infantry, the two sides drew abruptly. During the War of Liberation, the US ruling and opposition parties despised Chiang Kai-shek's military capabilities, thinking that the Kuomintang army was a waste of money. After the Korean War, the Americans suddenly discovered that the army organized by Chiang Kai-shek with such a small amount of money had been entangled with the People's Liberation Army on land for 4 years. He was really a rare general. Then, Chiang Kai-shek's status in the United States was greatly improved.